As Balmoral prepared for its most solemn summer in decades, a single arrival shattered the calm Camilla. But what no one expected was the chilling response from the one woman unafraid to protect the Queen's legacy, Princess Anne. Balmoral Castle had long been more than just a royal retreat. It was sacred ground untouched by the political maneuvering of palace corridors and insulated from the chaos of public duty. In the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's passing, it became a sanctuary of remembrance, where only those bound by genuine loyalty dared to tread. So when Camilla's car swept up the gravel path without prior notice, the silence of the Highlands was broken by more than just engine noise. It was an uninvited disturbance in a place meant for quiet healing. Staff exchanged glances, subtle, wary, uneasy. Whispers traveled fast. Camilla was here, and she wasn't supposed to be. Anne had arrived days earlier, quietly, purposefully, seeking solitude and reflection. She had guarded her mother's memory with a quiet intensity, and Balmoral had always been their shared refuge. The Queen's favorite escape from the noise of monarchy was now Anne's inherited duty to protect. So when Camilla stepped onto the grounds, dressed not in mourning but in quiet defiance, Anne's expression turned to stone. No greeting, no welcome, just a cold, piercing stare that said more than any words could. Staff paused in doorways, pretending not to watch but taking in every second of the unfolding tension. The Queen's daughter stood still as Camilla passed her, lips pressed tight, shoulders squared. There would be no embrace, no royal protocol. Not here, not now. The arrival was not just unexpected, it was provocative. The family had agreed, informally but unanimously, that this week would be a time of retreat. No public duties, no press, no drama. Yet here was Camilla, asserting her presence in a space where tradition dictated restraint. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a declaration. The history between Anne and Camilla had never been warm, but this silent standoff made it crystal clear. A reckoning was on the horizon. Their dynamic, long buried beneath years of royal duty, was bubbling to the surface. Camilla walked inside, pretending all was well. But Anne did not follow. She remained still for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the door that had just closed behind the Queen consort. There was no outburst. No immediate reaction, just a quiet, chilling calm that only those who truly knew Anne could recognize. A storm was brewing, but not the kind that made noise. This one would come in cold waves, precise strikes, and a sense of finality that would rattle the very structure of the royal house. Because this time, it wasn't just about titles or power, it was about sacred spaces, unspoken promises, and the haunting presence of a queen whose wishes were being trampled on. The battle lines had been drawn the moment Camilla crossed the threshold, and Anne, the unyielding guardian of legacy, was not going to stand by quietly. What was said in those stone corridors would echo across the monarchy, and Anne was just getting started. Anne had always believed in handling matters quietly, especially when it came to the preservation of the monarchy's soul. So, on the evening of Camilla's arrival at Balmoral, with the air thick with unspoken grief and ancestral weight, Anne chose diplomacy before battle. She requested a private conversation. No staff, no audience. Just two women who shared proximity to the throne but stood on opposite sides of everything the crown stood for. Anne's message was simple but firm. This wasn't the time nor the place for Camilla's presence. Balmoral was sacred, steeped in their mother's legacy. It wasn't just a retreat, it was the last place Queen Elizabeth had truly called home. And for Anne, her mother's wishes lived on in every stone, every corridor, every carefully preserved tradition. She told Camilla as much, with a voice that trembled not with fear, but with contained fury. She didn't beg, she didn't threaten. She simply urged Camilla to go for the dignity of the Queen and the unity of the family. But Camilla's response was not the retreat Anne had hoped for. Instead, it was a declaration. With a raised brow and chilling confidence, Camilla reminded Anne that she was no longer merely a guest at the table, she was Queen Consort. She had earned her place, she insisted, not by blood, but by perseverance. And if Balmoral was part of the royal estate, then she too had the right to walk its grounds. Anne remained silent for a beat too long, trying to process the brazen entitlement in Camilla's tone. Camilla went further, insinuating that Anne's tight grip on tradition was a relic of the past, that the monarchy had moved on. But Anne saw it for what it was, not progress, but power, hunger cloaked in royal rhetoric. Memories surged within Anne, memories of quiet walks with her mother, the long silences filled with meaning, the promise that Balmoral would remain untouched by politics and public showmanship. She remembered the Queen's frailty in her final days, whispering her wishes into the twilight air. And here was Camilla, trampling those wishes with each confident word. Anne's voice, once steady, began to rise, not in volume, but in gravity. She reminded Camilla of the countless times she had pushed boundaries, stepping too far, speaking too soon, always taking more than what was offered. This wasn't just about Balmoral anymore. This was about every moment Anne had watched Camilla rewrite royal lines to suit her own comfort. Camilla stood her ground, dismissing the warning with an air of practiced indifference. She had heard it all before, and yet, each word felt like a scratch on the crown she wore. But the tension didn't stay contained within that room. Despite their privacy, voices leaked through the ancient walls. Staff nearby, long accustomed to the hush of royal propriety, paused with trays in hand, ears catching fragments they never thought they'd hear. The sound of Anne, unfiltered. The sound of Camilla, defensive. Two women in a silent war that was finally breaking through. The conversation ended not with agreement but with a silence so cold it left frost in its wake. Anne turned and walked out first, each step heavy with decision. Camilla remained still, lips pursed, her power suddenly feeling fragile in the face of a daughter's devotion. But what neither of them could have anticipated was how short-lived that silence would be. Because in the cold light of morning, civility would shatter, and the entire royal family would be forced to choose a side. The morning after their private exchange, the air inside Balmoral was heavier than usual, thick with tension no one dared name aloud. Breakfast, a routine affair in the royal household, had always been a sacred ritual, especially in the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's passing. But on this day, the serenity was shattered in an instant. Anne walked in with purpose, her shoulders square and eyes locked on the one person who had no place at the table, Camilla. There were no greetings, no pleasantries, just silence, brittle and volatile. And then, with a voice that cut through the stillness like a blade, Anne spoke. She didn't whisper. She didn't soften her tone. She accused Camilla, in front of William, Catherine, and senior staff, of violating the sanctity of their mother's final wishes. Balmoral, she said, was not a stage for ambition. It was a chapel of memory, and Camilla had stormed through it like a conqueror, not a consort. Camilla, stunned but not speechless, straightened her spine and met Anne's fire with venom of her own. She declared, with cold certainty, that she was the queen consort now rightful, recognized, and respected. She had earned her title through endurance, through scandal and scrutiny, through years of being silenced and surviving it all. Her voice quivered not with fear, but with rage. She reminded them all that the monarchy had moved on, and so should its relics. But Anne wasn't finished. She laid bare the truth so many had tiptoed around. Camilla's rise had always come at the expense of legacy, not just Diana's, not just the Queen's, but the very traditions that held the monarchy together. Her presence at Balmoral wasn't just a personal insult, it was a desecration. William, caught between duty and devastation, attempted to calm the exchange. His words were careful, measured, but powerless against the storm building between these two women. He asked for restraint, for a return to civility. But civility had long left the room. Catherine, usually composed, sat frozen tears silently brimming in her eyes as she watched the divide grow deeper with every passing second. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but her silence said everything. It was more than grief. It was betrayal, betrayal by a family that had once stood as one, now splintered beyond repair. And then came the moment that would echo far beyond the walls of Balmoral. As Camilla rose from her seat, ready to flee the fire she could no longer extinguish, Anne delivered her final blow. Not in anger, but in absolute resolve. She declared that Camilla's presence was no longer welcome here. Not as queen, not as family, not as anything. The table, once a symbol of unity, had just witnessed its greatest fracture. Camilla left without looking back, but the scars she left behind would shape the monarchy's future. Because for Anne, words were never enough. Her next step would shake the very institution Camilla believed she had mastered. Anne's next move wouldn't just be symbolic. It would be institutional and devastating. The very next day, with the scent of confrontation still lingering in the air, Anne took a step that would send tremors through the monarchy. There was no delay, no second-guessing. She summoned her most senior aide, her voice calm but resolute, and issued a direct order that left no room for misinterpretation. Camilla was no longer permitted to return to Balmoral ever. Not for a season. Not for a ceremony. Not for any reason. The message wasn't wrapped in palace language or softened by pleasantries. It was blunt, final, and delivered with the kind of quiet conviction only Anne possessed. The aides, though stunned, didn't question her. They simply nodded and carried her words like royal decree. Within hours, staff across the estate were informed. From the gatekeepers to the household coordinators, everyone received the same instruction: Camilla was not to be housed, served, or welcomed in any official capacity at Balmoral moving forward. Even her name, whispered carefully by the less informed, was met with silence. For some, it felt like treason. For others, like justice. But to Anne, it was duty, pure and unshakable. This was more than a personal vendetta. It was a protective act, one she believed her mother would have quietly applauded, because Balmoral wasn't just a summer retreat. It was sacred ground. It was where the Queen found peace amid chaos. And Anne had vowed it would remain untouched by the politics of power. Memories surged of the Queen walking through the gardens, pausing to reflect, to mourn, to escape. It was here, in the quiet Scottish hills, that Queen Elizabeth had once confided in Anne her deepest fears. That legacy could be rewritten by force, if not fiercely protected. That Balmoral could one day become just another political stage, rather than a royal refuge. Those conversations, once locked away in Anne's heart, now returned with terrifying clarity. The Queen had known. She had seen it coming. And in her absence, Anne knew the weight of responsibility now rested entirely on her shoulders. News of the ban, though issued in private, did not stay hidden for long. Leaked messages from the palace hinted at a royal fracture deeper than ever before. Charles, already burdened by public pressure and personal sorrow, was reportedly torn. His silence was deafening. As a husband, he ached for Camilla. As monarch, he respected Anne's authority. He didn't interfere. He didn't reverse the ban. But behind the scenes, his inner circle watched as he drifted between two loyalties that could no longer coexist. What was once a family wound had now become an institutional rupture. Loyalists, especially those who had served under the Queen, began to take sides. Some wept quietly, declaring Anne the true guardian of royal values. Others questioned whether she had gone too far. But the divide was real and irreversible. Balmoral, once a symbol of quiet strength, had become a battlefield of principle. The echoes of Anne's decree were now reaching beyond castle walls, spilling into whispers among the aristocracy and power circles across the kingdom. And while Scotland reeled from the seismic shift, England was about to erupt. Because the public was catching wind of what had happened behind closed doors, and what they were about to see would leave the monarchy scrambling for control. The silence from the throne spoke louder than any royal decree. As news of the Balmoral ban rippled through the highest corridors of power, King Charles vanished from public view, retreating behind the thick walls of his private residence. There, away from the eyes of the press and the pressure of protocol, he was not a monarch. He was a man unraveling. The tension between duty and devotion clawed at him with every passing hour. On one side stood Anne, his sister, his confidant, the unwavering defender of their mother's legacy. On the other stood Camilla, his wife, his second chance, now publicly humiliated and privately livid. He had once imagined he could balance both worlds, that the crown would unify rather than divide. But Anne's ban had broken that illusion. Now, he was trapped in a quiet war between the woman who shaped his childhood and the woman who now shared his bed. A letter arrived, sealed in the familiar deep blue wax of Anne's personal crest. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was exact. Anne reminded him, in deliberate phrasing, of their mother's final wishes spoken in the quiet moments before her last summer at Balmoral. Queen Elizabeth had never formally excluded Camilla from royal retreats, but in her final weeks, she had whispered to Anne that some places should remain untouched by reinvention. Balmoral, she had said, must remain what it always was, sacred, still, and free from controversy. Anne's message to Charles was clear. This wasn't about punishment, it was about protection, about memory, about legacy. The Queen had entrusted her daughter, not her successor, with the stewardship of her spirit. Camilla, on the other hand, was anything but silent. Her frustration boiled over in long, emotional conversations with Charles. She urged him to step in, to defend her place, to remind the family and the world that she was not a side figure but queen consort. Her tone fluctuated between hurt and fury. She called the ban cruel, political, and unnecessary. She called Anne unforgiving, stuck in the past. But more than anything, she called on Charles as her husband, begging him to restore her dignity. Yet Charles, visibly strained and increasingly fragile, did not rise to meet her. His aides began to notice a shift, his temper shorter, his appearance pale, his thoughts often elsewhere. The emotional toll of being king, brother, and husband all at once was eroding him in real time. And still, he remained silent on the matter that everyone else was already whispering about behind closed doors. In those rare moments of solitude, Charles found himself pulled backward in memory. He remembered Anne as a child, always fierce, always firm, always defending their mother from palace gossip and press intrusions. He remembered the quiet looks between Anne and the Queen, the kind only those who truly understood each other exchanged. And he remembered the times when Anne had taken blows so their mother didn't have to. She hadn't changed. She had always been the sword and shield. He had just hoped she'd sheath it this once for him. But Charles knew what Camilla didn't, that Anne's resolve was not made of emotion but of purpose. And when it came to their mother, Anne did not bend. So, in a move that stunned those closest to him, Charles made his decision not with a public statement, not with royal flair, but with quiet, tragic finality. He would not overrule Anne. He would not revoke the ban. In that moment, Charles chose silence, knowing well it would cost him dearly. And with her husband unwilling to act, Camilla found herself more isolated than ever. But where Charles would not go, Camilla turned to someone far more dangerous, someone who had never truly embraced her presence, and who now held more public power than the king himself. With her back against the wall, Camilla prepared to face Prince William. With her position crumbling and the silence from Charles cutting deeper than any royal reprimand, Camilla made a move that many believed unthinkable. She requested a private meeting with Prince William. It was not formal, it was not public. It was arranged quietly, away from the press and palace aides at Kensington, where she hoped proximity might offer intimacy, and perhaps a path to redemption. But this was not the William of a decade ago. This was the future king, seasoned by scandal, matured by grief, and shaped by a deep, complex understanding of power and restraint. Camilla had spent years navigating monarchs. She thought she could handle William. What she didn't expect was just how cold his fire had become. As they sat together, Camilla didn't waste time. Her tone, once assertive, now trembled with urgency. She spoke of family, of misunderstanding, of the cruelty she felt in being exiled from Balmoral. But beneath the sorrow lay strategy. She reached back into the past, invoking the one name she knew could break through William's carefully constructed armor, Diana. She didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear, that she too had suffered public scorn, that she too had been misunderstood, that Diana, had she lived, might have recognized her struggle. It was a bold move, a dangerous one, and it failed the moment it left her lips. William, unwavering and unblinking, did not flinch. His voice was low, his words deliberate. He reminded her, without cruelty but without mercy, that Balmoral was not simply a royal estate. It was the soul of his grandmother. It was the one place where his mother's pain had never touched them, the one piece of the monarchy not stained by headlines and heartache. He looked at Camilla not as a stepmother, not as a queen, but as a guest who had overstayed her welcome. This, he said, is bigger than all of us. There was no opening for negotiation, no compromise. William's allegiance had been declared not in anger, but in unshakable loyalty to Anne, to his grandmother, and to the legacy they were fighting to protect. Catherine was present, silent but far from indifferent. She watched, listening intently, offering no glances of reassurance. Her absence of support spoke volumes. Camilla had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for sympathy, for at least one extended hand. But the silence surrounding her grew louder with every second. And in that moment, the truth settled like a stone. This family, the one she had clawed her way into, was now closing its doors. The walls were shifting, the circle was tightening, and Camilla, once at the center of it all, was being quietly, methodically pushed out. She left that meeting not with answers, but with certainty. Balmoral was lost. Charles would not defend her. William would not protect her. And Catherine, once thought to be an ally, now stood firmly in Anne's shadow. But just as Camilla began to reckon with her isolation, a discovery was unfolding in another corner of the monarchy. A long-guarded secret was about to rise from the depths, a vault tied to Queen Elizabeth herself, and what lay inside would do more than affirm Anne's actions. It would set the royal record on fire. Just when it seemed the royal family had reached its quiet breaking point, fate unearthed one final twist, an artifact from the Queen herself. As Anne combed through the archives during her extended stay at Balmoral, sorting through correspondence, ceremonial logs, and sealed boxes of her mother's private documents, she stumbled upon something that instantly chilled her. A small envelope, marked only with the Queen's personal seal and dated just weeks before her passing, had been tucked beneath a drawer long untouched. It wasn't labeled for public record. It wasn't included in any official transition. It was meant for eyes loyal enough to understand its weight and brave enough to act on its contents. And when Anne carefully opened that envelope, what she found inside would transform speculation into certainty and conviction into consequence. The letter wasn't long, but its brevity made it more powerful. In the Queen's own unmistakable handwriting, she spoke of Balmoral not as a royal estate, but as a sacred place, the one sanctuary untouched by ambition, she wrote. It must never become a stage. It must remain still. She went on to name Anne, not Charles, not William, but Anne as the last guardian of these sacred gates, the one she trusted to defend the invisible line between monarchy and spectacle. And then came the line that would shatter whatever fragile standing Camilla still held within those stone walls. No one, the Queen warned, who arrived through power, not blood, should govern its peace. Anne froze, not from shock, but from recognition. Her mother had seen what was coming, and with this letter, she had prepared Anne for the exact battle now at hand. She brought the letter to London immediately, not to parade it before the public, but to show the one person whose loyalty had never wavered, William. When he read it, his face didn't shift, but his hands tightened around the page. Catherine, reading beside him, said nothing, but tears quietly welled in her eyes. It was vindication, but it was also sorrowful, because the truth was no longer just felt, it was now documented, sealed, royal. This wasn't Anne's war anymore, it was the Queen's. The letter would never be leaked, not officially, but its existence was no longer a secret. Whispers ran through the palace, from chamber to corridor, until even the aides loyal to Camilla began to retreat from her orbit. Balmoral was no longer just a symbol. It had become a line in the sand drawn not by the living, but by the dead. And with this letter, Anne didn't need to raise her voice again. The Queen had spoken from beyond, and her words rang louder than any decree. But for Camilla, who had fought so long to rewrite her place in royal history, the revelation felt like a public slap, even if the letter was never meant to be seen by the world. Her exclusion had been sealed not by scandal, but by legacy. And though the gates of Balmoral remained closed, her rage was about to erupt in a very different arena, one where silence held no power and retaliation would come dressed in headlines. Because Camilla was done playing by royal rules, and the media was the only throne she had left to claim. Cornered by silence, humiliated by family, and eclipsed by the ghost of a queen's handwritten words, Camilla did what many in the palace feared most. She turned to the press. For years, she had mastered the art of restraint, of keeping battles behind polished palace doors. But this time, with her voice drowned out and her influence waning, she sought control not within the monarchy but beyond it. In a carefully calculated leak to a sympathetic tabloid, Camilla's team released a statement that sent shockwaves through royal media circles. Cloaked in vague language but loaded with emotional punches, the message painted her as a woman betrayed, not just by protocol, but by a family clinging to the past. She positioned herself as the target of royal elitism, ostracized not for her actions, but for daring to stand where others insisted she didn't belong. The narrative was crafted with precision. Camilla as the overlooked outsider, Anne as the unrelenting gatekeeper, and Balmoral as the battleground for a monarchy resistant to modernity. The story gained traction immediately, picked up by morning broadcasts and echoing across online headlines. But what Camilla underestimated was the mood of the public. The monarchy had endured scandals before, but this time, the Queen's memory was involved. Anne, long respected but rarely celebrated, emerged suddenly as a quiet heroine. Her refusal to bow to palace politics struck a chord. The backlash against Camilla was swift and brutal. Hashtags like "Protect Balmoral" and "Anne the Iron Princess" flooded social media. Memes of Anne standing stoically against a golden backdrop while Camilla was airbrushed into the shadows trended for days. Even commentators who once supported Camilla began to question her judgment. The letter, though never officially released, had become legend. And against that legend, Camilla's public relations crusade looked desperate, transparent, even pitiful. Instead of controlling the story, she had thrown gasoline onto a fire that now consumed her every move. In response to the escalating media circus, Camilla vanished. No public engagements, no appearances, no statements. It was as if the Queen consort had evaporated from public life. Whispers swirled. Was she unwell? Had she fled? Or was she being quietly silenced by the very institution she once fought to claim? Meanwhile, the strain on Charles reached a breaking point. Already weakened by the emotional toll of choosing between wife and sister, the king was forced to cancel several official duties. Palace insiders hinted at stress-induced fatigue. But behind the scenes, it was something deeper. The storm Camilla had unleashed now loomed over them both, with the monarchy once again teetering on the edge of fracture. And yet, as the headlines began to cool and the public prepared to move on, Anne was not finished. While others retreated, she stepped forward not with another ban, not with another speech, but with a move so measured and precise that it would silence every critic and command the respect of even her quietest opponents. Because what came next was not just an assertion of authority, it was a tribute to legacy, and a final, resounding message that the Queen's spirit had not been buried, but reborn through her daughter. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.